Hello from New York, I'm Chris Hayes. With me this morning, I have Avik Roy, healthcare policy advisor for the Romney campaign, Elise Hogue from the Friends of Democracy Super PAC, which supports campaign finance reform, Heather McGhee of the progressive think tank Demos, and Rick Hertzberg of the New Yorker magazine. We were talking about the president's second-term agenda, the plan that was put out with the campaign this week, but the fact that the strangeness of our political calendar is the president's second term begins the day after the election if he's reelected. It begins before his first term ends, because the big forcing mechanism of what's called the fiscal cliff, which is the expiration of the Bush tax cuts, the implementation of what are called sequestration cuts, spending cuts that were put in place to resolve the debt ceiling crisis, are going to happen at the end of the year, and in that lame duck session they're going to negotiate, we think, some way out of it. In fact, the president, I thought, made news in the last debate where he said sequestration will not happen, which I thought was giving away some leverage, right? Because presumably if you think, that is your leverage to say, well, if you don't want the deal, then we're going to drive over the cliff.
But that was the idea when,
You're so frustrated by this.
I really am, I'm sorry. But that was the idea when sequestration was put into place. It was like, oh, this is never going to happen.
Right.
This is just this hatchet. And this is what happens. Like, once in the political ecosphere, something is sort of dropped in, even if it's from planet Mars, as frankly I think Bowles Simpson is, and I think as a sequestration, the idea of just sort of chopping off our budget, one half defense, one half not, whatever, it just becomes like part of the ecosystem in this very strange way. So I think the president was really saying, oh no, of course sequestration is not going to happen, because no one ever thought it would happen. It thought, we would force ourselves to come back to the table, which is strange to think that that's what our elected officials have to do.
And this is why it won't, because I think if you want to summarize the Budget Control Act and all that, basically Republicans won on the scale of the spending cuts, but Democrats won on the content of the cuts. So half of it's defense. There are no cuts really to health care, a little bit to Medicare, but that's about it. So it's really the content of the cuts preserved Democratic priorities, whereas the scale of the cuts is where Republicans won by and large. And so the thing is,
but there were no tax increases, which was the thing that was the do or die thing for Republicans. And always will be forever and ever and ever.
Right, the scale and no tax increase. Those were the things that Republicans won on, and they conceded on the content of the cuts because those were their primary objectives. And
but they did start saying the day after.
The day after that we shouldn't make these cuts.
Yeah, that the defense was off the table. They were not going to abide by this. This was not binding.
Sure, but I just want to say that my point is that I think we're optimistic if we think that Capitol has an incentive to compromise here, because if Democrats sit down and say, look, if we're stuck with this framework where we don't have any tax increase and we have spending cuts, these are the spending cuts we want, and it's hard to see how Republicans alter that dynamic if they don't control the Senate.
Well, Republicans alter that dynamic by putting revenue on the table. I mean, I think that's the thing. That's been the thing from the beginning. And of course, we have the iconic moment in the Republican primary when everyone was asked, "Would you take a 10-to-1 deal? Right? Would you take $10 of spending cuts for every $1 raised revenue?" And not a single person on stage raised their hand, including current nominee Mitt Romney. That is the issue to me. Rick, do you think there'll be any difference in the behavior of the Republican House if they are coming off a victory for Barack Obama?
I don't see why there should be, because of the incentives that these politicians have in their own careers. Again, these guys are from Republican districts. So the Republicans are from Republican districts. It's Republicans that they have to please, and they've shown themselves far more willing to strap a suicide vest not onto themselves but onto the country. And then say, oh, it's your responsibility to keep this thing from blowing up. We have no responsibility. We have no responsibility. And it's part of the mythology of the presidency, too, that somehow the president is always the one who calls all the shots, who's always in charge. And that's fed in these presidential campaigns, where the presidential candidates put out their visions as if
that's right,
visions
exactly.
are going to be realized automatically. So it's a machine for disappointment.
I think that's what democracy is called. Democracy, a machine.
I think it's really important for folks to remember, too, and I have no idea how this plays into the incentives of a congressional brain, but Heather's right. We've been through this before. The last time we couldn't get a debt deal was when congressional favorability hit its all-time historic low. People are sick of this. People are sick of playing Russian roulette with the economy, and everybody suffers.
And you have a Congress that has got a public opinion rating in single digits, and yet 97% of them are going to be
right. That's the point. There's a huge distinction between what their collective
because you can't vote against Congress. You can vote against 1/435th of Congress.
There is one place where I think, and the president, this was the other thing that he said when he's talking to the Des Moines Register about the stacking of what he envisioned for a second term. You got to do the fiscal cliff first because that's when on the calendar. And then this was what he said next. The second thing I'm confident will get done next year is immigration reform. And since this is off the record, I'll just be very blunt. Should I win a second term? A big reason I will win a second term is because the Republican nominee and the Republican Party have so alienated the fastest growing demographic in the country, the Latino community. This is a relatively new phenomenon. George Bush and Karl Rove were smart enough to understand the changing nature of America. And so I'm fairly confident they're going to have a deep interest in getting that done. Now, the political case, Andrew Sullivan was the one who wrote this political case that, if Barack Obama's reelected, the chastened Republicans will want to see a deal on the budget. Absolutely not. I think we're all in agreement. It's going to be the exact same dynamics as has been before. I think actually there is a persuasive case on this on immigration. I really do. And as a Republican, Ovik, I'm wondering if you think the same thing.
Well, George W. Bush tried to propose bipartisan immigration reform. It was sunk by the base in both parties that had for different reasons proposing
that is just not true. To say it was the base in both parties. Labor, which historically had always opposed these, did the tough thing. They bit down. They went to their members, many of their members who were really suspicious of this, and sold them that comprehensive immigration bill. They got this is McCain-Kennedy we're talking about. It was not killed by the left base. It just wasn't. It was killed by the right-wing base. And the reason you know that is that in 2008, when the candidates were running, John McCain took his name off the bill while Barack Obama still proposed it. So it's just not true. It was killed by the base in both parties.
Well, so let's talk about what Barack Obama's done. He hasn't proposed a bipartisan immigration plan, right? And I think one of the things that comes out of Bob Woodward's most recent book is that President Obama actually doesn't enjoy the policy negotiations with Congress. It's not his
Why
thing.
would you enjoy the policy negotiations with this Congress? You would have to be a masochist to enjoy the policy negotiations.
That's how you pass legislation. Bill Clinton did enjoy those policies because maybe he was a masochist, but the point is that in order to get things done,
yeah, exactly. That's what he got for it.
In order to get difficult things done in Washington, you have to get into the nitty-gritty and have those policies.
But let me ask. Let me ask you about this because Mitt Romney, we all saw him get up there and just take the wood to Rick Perry in the primaries on immigration. You want to spend $100,000 of taxpayer money on these illegals? His words, these illegals that are coming into this country, that's what you want to do. Now, the question is, why did he do that? And the answer is clear. The incentives in the conservative base are to use that kind of language and beat up and get to the right of people. The question is, if those are the incentives at that point in the campaign, why are the incentives going to be any different?
Well,
when are they going to change?
I think it's a challenging issue, right? I mean, there's no doubt that for a lot of different reasons, immigration reform has been hard. That's why it hasn't been done yet. But how does it get done? It gets done when people of different persuasions get together and say, I'll give on this if you'll give on that. And that process stuff, that boring, unsexy process stuff is what the president has been unwilling to do. And
I disagree.
On Wall Street
and the Affordable Care Act and the Recovery Act.
That was a partisan bill that passed with 60. No Republicans voted. But you can blame Republicans for not voting. You can blame the partisanship either way. But the point is that was not a bipartisan compromise. And again, I think that's Romney's temperament is he wants to get people together. And you might disagree, and I think the left might disagree, but I think that's his history, that's his temperament. He's a guy who tries to bring people together, and he's willing to make compromises on policy points in order to get broader bipartisan deal done.
If we were going to elect Mitt Romney, with a Congress that was 87% Democrat in both houses, that would be one thing. I would be very curious to see how Mitt Romney would conduct himself, which is basically the numbers that he had in Massachusetts. But we are not electing him with that. We are electing him with a House Republican caucus that is, devoted to a very right-wing vision of the country. That's their right. I mean, they're genuinely conservatives. They believe in what they believe in. But that's the Congress that we're going to have. And I just don't see how that is going to change the behavior of the Republican Party institutionally.
I think it gets done when it's a matter of survival. When more of these guys in the House need the Latino vote in their districts to get reelected. It is the opposite dynamics of what we're seeing on climate change, right? Because as a matter of survival, the GOP needs oil money. So the disincentives there are going to last for generations more. The dynamics are going to change much more quickly in in Republican districts, among others.
All right, a deep dive into the career of the Republican lawyer behind the myth of voter fraud. That's next. All right, this week, President Obama was finally asked about one of the crucial issues of this election season, an issue that didn't surface during any of the debates. And mind you, it took comedian and talk show host Jay Leno to ask the president to directly take on the issue of voter suppression.
Look at this billboard here. Look at this billboard from Carlos. Show it. The voters will be asked, but not required. That's a billboard. I think it was in Colorado. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it's like they make it look like you have to have this. But if you read the fine print, it says you don't really have to.
Right. It's a problem.
It's a little scary.
Now, you know, the Justice Department handles all these cases,
Mm-hmm.
so, you know, I can't weigh in on any particular state. Mm-hmm. Here's one thing I know, that throughout our history, our country's always been stronger when everybody had a voice. And, you know, it took a long time to make sure that the franchise expanded to everybody. But we should be thinking about ways to make it easier for folks to vote, not to make it harder for folks to vote. And, you know, and that's why this early voting is actually really terrific.
This network has specifically addressed voter suppression laws throughout the country, which have almost invariably been put forth by Republican governors and lawmakers, laws that disproportionately affect poor, student, Black, and Latino voters. In short, Democratic voters. During a convention speech, Democratic Congressman John Lewis reminded people that legal efforts to block the path of legitimate voters isn't new.
Not too long ago, people stood in unmovable lines. They had to pass a so-called literacy test, pay a poll tax. On one occasion, a man was asked to count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap. On another occasion, one was asked to count the jelly beans in a jar, all to keep them from casting their ballot. Today, it is unbelievable that there are Republican officials are trying to stop some people from voting.
Republicans who support voter ID laws claim they are needed, insisting that the threat of election fraud is compelling and rampant. But as the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law points out, one is more likely to be struck by lightning than to commit voter fraud. Reporter Jane Mayer draws out the voter fraud myth in her new piece in the New Yorker magazine, fantastic piece, focusing on Republican lawyer Hans von Spakovsky, whom she says has, quote, stoked fear about imposters at the polls. We'll talk about von Spakovsky's impact on voter suppression in a moment. But if the assault on voting rights characterized the first act of this election story, the less told story is of a second act, in which activists and lawyers have struck back with a vengeance, winning a series of dramatic victories. In Pennsylvania, a judge blocked a voter ID law from taking effect before the election. In Ohio, the U.S. Court of Appeals reinstated early voting. In Florida, a judge blocked restrictions on voter registration, and voter ID laws have been taken off the table in Wisconsin, setting up an election day that will be less restricted than it once appeared, and bringing us to this story's third and final act, when people actually cast their ballots. And if the election is as close as it looks like it will be, the same conservative agitators and activists like von Spakovsky, who led the effort to suppress the vote, will be at the courthouse the morning after the election with the opening salvos in the post-vote battle. Joining us now at the table is Bertha Lewis, the former chief executive officer and chief organizer of ACORN. Maybe you remember them. Ari Berman, my colleague at The Nation magazine, who's done the best coverage on this issue throughout the entire campaign, and Jane Mayer from the New Yorker magazine. It's great to have you all here.
Great to be with you.
So this is such a complicated story because there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of little bits of information and different things happening in different states. At another level, it's a very simple story because it's about one group of people trying to get another group of people not to vote. Before we get into the von Spakovsky sort of deep dive you do in the magazine, which is fantastic, and before we talk about what it looks like to be the former head of ACORN watching all of this unfold when you were really the test case, could they go and get away with going after Democrats' efforts to broaden the franchise? Ari, I want to start with you about where we are right now, because I think it's important that we don't lose sight of the fact that in some ways this story is a hopeful story insofar as the counter-mobilization has been really impressive.
Well, it's hopefully a hopeful story. The jury is still out. I mean, I think you said it right in your introduction, which was 2011 was the year when Republicans, in sweeping ways, passed laws to restrict the right to vote. One of the most significant legal changes probably in the last 50 years occurred in 1 year alone. And 2012 was the year when the courts really fought back and blocked, at least temporarily, all of these laws. So a lot of the laws aren't on the books now. The question is, how will they be enforced on Election Day? In Pennsylvania, for example, will people be wrongly told they need ID? In Florida, will people show up? Will they not be on the voting rolls? all sorts of swing states still have problematic laws on the books. Places like Virginia have voter ID laws on the books. Florida still has laws disenfranchising ex-felons on the books. So there's still the possibility for a significant amount of confusion. I'm hoping that because there's been so much coverage of this issue that people know what the laws are in their states. But we've had court decisions 3 weeks before the election. Yeah. So people are going to be rightly confused on what the story is on Election Day.
I've been hearing from people who are actually out there canvassing that there is a lot of confusion. Right. People are really uncertain right now about what they need to bring to the polls or whether they'll be challenged in some way. So, I mean, confusion is in itself a tactic to some extent. But I'm a little less maybe optimistic about what happened in the courts than maybe some people might be, because while the courts have suspended a number of these rules, it's temporary. They've said basically this isn't going to work for this election. The states haven't had enough time to implement it, but they will be able to be implemented after this election. So moving forward towards the next election, I think we're talking about some of these laws going into effect, and I think also we're going to see that a major provision of the Voting Rights Act may be challenged.
And I have to correct one thing Ari said, and this goes to Bertha, sitting right next to me, who I love. The courts did not fight back. We had people on the ground in Pennsylvania identifying plaintiffs who were being denied their right to vote and putting them out to win the court of public opinion. And that's what we're drastically missing since we have no ACORN.
And you also had folks pointing out the issue. I mean, from the Brennan Center to the Advanced Project. I mean, look, folks have to fight. But here's the good thing. Here's the good news. You know, now that we know that these guys really are just liars and will do whatever it takes to steal an election or to pretend as though they are protecting democracy, it actually has energized at least my folks I talk to, the folks, you know, those older people, young people, poor people, black people, brown people, people of color. We are out. We're on it. Because you know what? We said, oh, really? Is that how you're going to roll? Well, here's what's going to happen. We're rolling on the polls.
There's this lemonade project that's happening in Florida. Al Sharpton's been involved in that. He was down there, and which is basically make lemonade out of lemons. And this counter mobilization, Dave Weigel had a piece he was reporting down in Florida where he was talking to folks. People said the same thing. You know, it's possible that there might have been a lack of enthusiasm, or, you know, it's tough economic times and that might squeeze people down. But part of seeing someone come at you that way with basically saying no, that has been an incredibly energizing force. I want to talk about the sort of prehistory of this, and also the way that the perverse way in which creating uncertainty and confusion in and of itself accomplishes a political aim, which I think is really part of the insidious part of the story. And you talk about that in your New Yorker piece, and I want to talk about that right after we take this break. We're talking about voter suppression and the counter-mobilization against efforts to suppress the vote. And I want to talk to you, Jane Mayer, about this great profile you wrote in the New Yorker. Before I want to do that, though, I want to make a kind of programming note about this issue, which is that, you know, one of the things we try to do here on the show is bring people together from diverse perspectives, and we try to have conversations and conflict and root through issues. And there are a few issues where I just can't find anyone in good faith. I'm very serious. The voter fraud and climate are these two things where it's just like, you know, the climate's getting warmer and we're not going to have anyone at the table who says otherwise. And voter fraud just doesn't exist in any sort of systemic way. It's just not a big issue, and we're not going to have someone at the table to talk about that. So that's just like the reason that we're all sitting around here basically largely in tune on the issue. It's just this is one of those issues where I cannot in good faith have someone at the table who I think is pursuing good faith, who really is pointing to some empirical grounding for this. And Jane, this is something that comes across in your article. Tell me who Hans van Spakovsky is and what his role has been in creating this kind of tidal wave of voter suppression.
Well, he may be the leading alarmist about in-person voter fraud, the kind where you pretend to be someone else at the polls. And he's been sounding this alarm really since the 1990s. And so I read his book. He's got a book out and it would make you think that American elections are like some banana republic, and that we are, you know, they're going to be stolen. And so I read it, and I went to go talk to him, and it was interesting because he gives a number of examples, and I looked at them more closely. And every time I drilled down to figure out whether what he was saying was in good faith and true, I found a lot of holes in his arguments. They fall apart when you take a close look. And the truth is, really, there isn't that kind of voter fraud in this country. The most recent study showed since 2000, there have been 7 cases of voter fraud identification, in-person voter fraud, the kind that would be cured with an ID. 7 since 2000.
7 since 2000.
Okay, I mean, there are more cases of violations of migratory bird statutes than there are of election laws. It's concocted, basically, and so, but it is a very useful concoction, I think.
And it has been concocted and also promoted by him specifically and John Fund at the Wall Street Journal, and the two of them have really succeeded. I mean, what I find so frustrating about this is that they've pulled off this hustle on their own base, right? Because you talk to grassroots conservatives and they are absolutely convinced, because they're listening to these people, that this is happening all the time, right? The people they get their information from, they are absolutely convinced.
But who is that base?
But they are working with, Von Spakovsky's at the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank, so he's got a platform, and he writes, and he's on Fox News a lot, and they also have helped advise this organization that looks grassroots, called True the Vote, that comes out of Texas. It looks like it's a spontaneous citizens movement. It's directed by these people who are really professional operatives, basically. Conservative operatives who know what they're doing.
And the fascinating thing about Jane's article, and I really liked it.
Thank you.
Another great piece, Jane, is that Von Spakovsky was this fringe figure largely in the Republican Party for many, many years. And now he's basically the spokesman for the Republican Party on voting issues. And I think it kind of shows the evolution of the Republican Party in a disturbing way, or the de-evolution of the Republican Party on this issue. Because in 2006, the Voting Rights Act was overwhelmingly reauthorized by Congress, including by virtually all Republicans. Now you have, instead, the core issue of the Republican Party is restricting the right to vote. And voter suppression has become the new normal inside the Republican Party. They're not going to drop these efforts after 2012. This is their only response to demographic change, is to stir up fears of voter fraud and then use them to try to make it harder for the growing electorate, young people, African Americans, Hispanics, to be able to cast a ballot.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I was going to say, this is about demographics. When you said their base just swallows as whole, who is that base? That is a base that is shrinking in this country. This country is browning. If people of color are going to be the new majority in this country, then you have folks out there that see this as an absolute threat. My former organization, ACORN, we organized poor people, people of color, brown people, young people, people in the projects, people that folks said they don't come out to vote, they never will. Yeah. We moved people to vote based on issues. Like in Florida, we moved folks, over 1 million people, to the polls to vote to raise that state's minimum wage because the federal government hadn't done it. ALEC, this American Legislative Exchange, who does the templates for all of these bills. This Spakovsky guy is in league with them. This is a strategy to combat the changing demographics and power shift of this country.
And every now and then someone speaks the truth about it from the conservative side. They generally try to portray themselves as nonpartisan and just working for fair and elections. But in truth, the founder of ALEC, Paul Weyrich, who's also the founder of the Heritage Foundation, said out loud at some point, we don't want everybody to vote. It is not good for certain points of view that to have everybody enfranchised. And I think we heard it again in Pennsylvania with Mike Turzai.
We said we did voter ID. That's going to get
Romney. That'll get Romney elected. It is something that helps one party more than the other party. Generally, they don't tell it like that, but that is really what they'll say every now and then.
One of the things I think has been a fascinating through line of this year, watching this from a broad ideological perspective, is a reminder of there is a historical debate between the left and the right about democracy. Right? I mean, this is actually the roots of the roots of the right wing. Of course, are going back to Edmund Burke and this kind of counter-revolutionary look of democratic revolutions as being ghastly, as being mob rule. And there is a long intellectual tradition. We were just talking about the Electoral College, right? I mean, the Electoral College has a lot more support on the right than on the left. The national popular vote has been passed all in blue states, right? Because there actually is an ideological difference about democracy as the best means of ruling a people. Elise, you've been traveling around the country. I want to hear what you've been seeing, but first we got to take a quick break. Sorry. Elise Hogue, you've been traveling around in a lot of different races, and you wanted to say something.
Yeah, no, I did. So what I've been seeing all over the country is twofold. One, extremely educated volunteers, right? DMV employees very confused about what they're supposed to do. Volunteers better equipped than I've ever seen to get people what they need, where they need it, state by state. The other point that I wanted to make, it goes to what you were saying about this fight about democracy. I actually think this is not Republican-Democrat. I think this is 1%, 99%. This is why we saw the Romney fundraiser folks saying, well, my nail lady isn't educated enough to vote, right? And so one of the things that I think is really interesting, and it goes to the Alex stuff, is voter suppression could be the Achilles heel on all of their manufactured narratives. We saw corporations fleeing Alex because they did not want to be on the wrong side of democracy. We did not see that, even though Alex has pushed regressive legislation on everything from climate change to gun rights. So one of the things that we've seen is there's a vulnerability around this issue that we need to learn to leverage across the board for other progressive issues.
No, I think you're right. One of the reasons that I founded my new organization called theblackinstitute.org. One is because of the demographics. If, in fact, we're going to be a new majority of people of color, then somebody better pay attention and develop policies for us and about us. And two, that black folks, people of color, are not in an economic fairness conversation, which is this pitting of 1% against the 99% and who rules and who doesn't. Climate change, if you're not talking about people of color being a part of that discussion. The privatization of education, again, this is, from income inequality to predatory education. And then finally, immigration. Black faces are not in the immigration debate, and that is the one thing that's going to occur no matter who wins this election. But Elise is right. You've got to look at this as not a Democrat Republican thing or a right-left thing.
But there is, let me just say this, there is a right-left thing insofar as the fact that...
I'm on the left, I will admit, that's it.
So in 2009, PPP did a poll and found that 52% of GOP voters...
Yes. More right.
Nationally think that Acorn stole the presidential election for Barack Obama.
Yep.
I mean, this is what the myth making that has happened through John Fund and von Spakovsky has been very effective, and this is what people hear. And right now, I mean, here's the grand irony. There's this amazing incident of a Republican firm that's got $3 million. Tell me about this firm, Ari, because you've been covering this.
Well, there's this firm, Strategic Allied Consulting. They are run by a very checkered GOP operative, Nathan Spruill, with a long history of potentially committing GOP voter registration fraud. He was the main person funded by the RNC to do voter registration work, and all these fraudulent forms turned up not only in Florida but in other battleground states like Colorado. They were registering dead people, the exact thing they claimed Acorn was doing. They were changing voter registration forms from Democratic to Republican. They were registering tons of people at the same addresses. So essentially, Republican operatives were doing the very things they accused Acorn of doing. It's an incredible moment of hypocrisy on the right.
Well, I mean, and there are kinds, I think we should say, there are kinds of election fraud. There is registration fraud. There's absentee ballot fraud historically. People throw out whole boxes of absentee ballots sometimes. What was striking to me was there just is not the kind of fraud that gets cured with an ID. And so exactly the whole movement on the Republican side has been to push through laws that John Lewis said to me, the congressman, it's a cure for a disease that doesn't exist. I do think, in fairness, we have to say that there is a very sloppy administration of American elections, and it is a real vulnerability for both parties, and it's kind of a shameful thing that this greatest democracy in the world is administered so sloppily.
Well, in the famous words of Chris Hayes, it is profane. and here's what is the problem with it. And again, leading Acorn, we used to put up a sign that no good deed goes unpunished. We, at one point at our peak, we accounted for 25% of all voter registration in this country. 25%. So just that number alone put a big target on our backs.
Right.
We had a quality control in which we never threw out a card. We flagged and tagged every suspicious card. We also went to the Board of Elections, who are woefully underfunded, by the way, and said, John Doe was a canvasser. Here's his name, his address, his phone number. These are the cards that he did. We did the job for them. And so therefore, because of the people that we were moving, we didn't just register folks. Right. We also moved them to the poll. We had to be
I want to raise the issue here, because I think one of the things that gets really lost in this, and it's been very productive for the people who are kind of raising the specter of voter fraud to raise, is that there is a difference between errors and fraud.
Yeah.
I mean, I want to talk about that, because there were errors in some of the stuff that Acorn gave in Florida. That was the thing they used to hang on you. I want you to talk about that. No, I want you to talk about that right after this break.
I mean, okay.
So, Bertha Lewis, there were these stories that happened, right? That you were embroiled in the big Acorn scandal that ended up being the sledgehammer brought down on the organization that had registered, but accounted for 25% of the registrations in the country. And I want you to talk about, you know, the way that they came after you was they pulled out some registration that had been filled out by someone that Acorn had employed. That's right. That was Mickey Mouse or something, some such ridiculousness. Right. And when you hear the case made about this rampant voter fraud, it is these discrete examples of a registration for Mickey Mouse or someone registered who was dead. And I want you to just give your response to that. Why should I believe that you weren't undertaking some massive fraud?
Well, first of all, Mickey Mouse never went to vote.
Right, but that's
number one.
Point.
Number two is we were the ones that handed to the Board of Elections. We said, you know what? John Doe here registered Mickey Mouse. This looks suspicious. Right. Again, we flagged and tagged everyone, unlike Mr. Spruill, who the Board of Elections had to look and say that these cards are suspicious. Unlike Mr. Spruill, it is illegal to throw out any card. So we flagged and tagged, and they did not. We don't. Does it make sense for an organization that organizes low and moderate income folks and people of color to fraudulently register someone who we can't get to the polls?
Right. And I think this point about this is so key, right? If you pass along, the point is that you have a duty to pass along every registration card, because you don't want the organization to be the one throwing out cards, which is exactly what happened with Spruill, that is a huge problem. You can't have someone go, I meet you outside the 7-Eleven. Oh, you haven't voted before? I'm going to register you to vote. I take down your information. You walk away thinking, great, I'm going to show up at the polls. And then I throw it in the trash.
Yeah.
That's
the voter
problem.
Registration fraud that Republicans have committed recently is far worse than what Acorn actually did. But yet there's been no coverage of it on the right. And this is the problem here. Fox News ran 122 stories about Acorn from 2007 to 2008. They've run 3 stories on GOP voter registration fraud in Florida and none in Virginia, where they threw out voter registration forms. The Weekly Standard, the National Review, 0 stories about GOP voter registration fraud. So viewers of Fox News are coming away with the perception that it's still only being done by Democrats. They have no conception that their side is the one doing the very things they're accusing Democrats and progressives of doing.
As we head towards Election Day, and right now, one of the reasons I think obviously the Obama campaign is pushing early voting is because it gives you several bites at the apple if there are any problems, right? If you go 10 days before the election and you show up and your name isn't on the list, then you've got 9 days to get it sorted out and actually vote. Whereas if you showed up at 5 p.m. on that Tuesday and the name's on the list, then you have to cast a provisional ballot. You made this point before, and I think this is a good place for us to end up on, which is the administration of elections in this country is pretty bonkers. We all saw this in 2000, and there was a bill passed called the Help America Vote Act. DeForest Soares was appointed to the head of the Election Assistance Commission, the body tasked with implementing this law that was going to standardize our election administration. And this is what he had to say about his time doing that.
We had $0 for research year one of the EAC. And what I wanted was enough money, and we suspected that $10 million would do it. I hung in there until after the election, and right after the election, I notified the White House that I was leaving. I've got 16-year-old sons, and I'd rather spend time with them at their basketball games than to work in Washington with a Congress and a White House that is not really committed to this task, which I thought was fundamental to our democracy.
That's a Congress and a White House, a Republican Congress and a Republican White House at the time. What did you hear from your sources, like Vance Pakovsky and others, about how they view what's going to happen on Election Day thereafter?
Well, I mean, it's disconcerting. Basically, what they're saying is that they think there's a good possibility that it will be worse than 2000, worse than Florida. I mean, Vance Pakovsky, John Fund said there might be 3 or 4 states like Florida. Vance Pakovsky said, if we're lucky, 3 or 4, there may be more than that. I mean, if this election is really close, you get into what they call the margin of litigation, which means all the lawyers come out and they are going to be fighting. And I mean, it's a worry because the country's very divided politically, and elections are administered very poorly, right. And so there's a lot of area for litigation, confusion, and then of course that undermines the legitimacy of the outcome.
And I think one of the things to keep in mind here is that the seeds they've been planting, they can harvest the fruit of if there's a close election, which is that the whole story has been about fraud and about people sneaking to vote that shouldn't vote, and about how people are not qualified or casting their vote, and then you plant the seeds to then afterwards start going after striking provisional ballots and votes like that. Bertha Lewis, former CEO of ACORN, which was a great organization. I'm going to say it on national television. Now president of the African American advocacy group, the Black Institute. Ari Berman, my colleague at The Nation magazine, and Jane Mayer from the New Yorker magazine. Be sure to check out her piece in this issue. Thank you all for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
You should know for the Newsweek ahead, coming up next. In just a moment, what we should know for the Newsweek ahead, but first, a quick update on a guest we had on the show back in March, Mike Aus. Mike is the priest who came out on our show as a non-believer. He's been a working pastor at a non-denominational church in Houston, but now he's started a new organization along with several other atheists, free thinkers, and secular humanists called Houston Oasis to provide support and fellowship to people who don't want to be part of organized religion. And a quick personal update, if you're in the Boston area, I'm planning to be appearing at MIT on Tuesday, weather notwithstanding, at 7 p.m. to talk about my book, Twilight of the Elites and the Election. For details on Tuesday's event up at MIT, go to facebook.com/upwithchris. So, what should you know for the week coming up? Well, in a nation where bipartisan consensus tells us we are equally accountable to justice, but that the nation will suffer somehow if we apply justice to the deeds of those who ran the country, you should know that other democracies actually do hold former heads of state criminally accountable. Italy's former Premier Silvio Berlusconi was convicted Friday of tax fraud and sentenced to 4 years in prison. And yes, you could always argue that he always seemed to get off on appeal, but he's also still in court on charges he paid for sex with a minor and tried to cover it up. As you watch the freakish late-season Hurricane Sandy make its way towards the eastern seaboard today, you should know that large corporate entities who make their money by assessing and quantifying risk are freaked out about the effects of climate change that we are already seeing. A new report from top reinsurer Munich Re, those are companies that insure insurers, concludes that, quote, climate-driven changes are already evident over the last few decades for severe thunderstorms, heavy precipitation and flash flooding, hurricane activity, and for heat wave, drought, and wildfire dynamics in parts of North America. You should know that this is just the beginning, and that if Republicans really believed in the market and the information discovery role of markets, they'd be listening to the world's insurance companies rather than fossil fuel-funded cranks. And finally, you should know that even good economic news can have undesirable consequences for the long term. This week, Chrysler will add 1,100 new workers at a plant in Detroit thanks to rising demand for its cars. The plant has had workers on overtime for months just to keep up, is now adding a third crew so the factory can be operational for more hours in the day. You should know it's hard to imagine these new jobs without Chrysler, and it's hard to imagine Chrysler without the auto rescue. But because the new vehicles these workers will be making are SUVs, you should know that while the comeback of the auto industry is good for American workers in the short term, it's only good for all of us in the long term if the industry goes through a revolution that dramatically increases the efficiency and reduces the emissions of the cars it produces. Want to find out what my guests think you should know for the coming week? Avik Roy?
So, I think one of the things that's been distressing over the last couple of days has been there's been more drips out of the Benghazi situation. So there was a CIA annex that apparently asked for military intervention and were denied 3 times. It's unclear if that was from the Pentagon, whether it was the president. Who knows? But I think we're going to see a lot more drips from that next week, and that's going to be a news story that's going to continue to hit the headlines.
We've covered Benghazi quite a bit on this show, and I'm at the point where what I thought I knew, I then turned out not to know, and so have been taking things very cautiously because there was a lot of rushing pouncing. There was a lot of, it was about the movie, it wasn't about the movie, and every time we get wrong-footed. And I think there's been a lot of pouncing on everything. So my editorial approach has really been a wait-and-see attitude, because each new discrete piece of information seems to me to mislead as much as it reveals. Elise Hogue.
You should know that if you are sick of elections, awash in corporate and anonymous cash, there is an opportunity within reach in New York State to actually get the Senate that can pass public funding. And you should know that if it can happen in New York, it can happen anywhere.
And you should know Andrew Cuomo is on the fence about it, or says he supports it?
He says he supports it. He says if there's a political path forward, he'll take it, which is why it's incredibly important. If you live in New York, vote down ballot. If you know anyone who lives in New York, we need a Democratic Senate.
Heather McGhee.
In this era of real sort of hyper-partisanship, we know that citizens are actually united on these issues. It's actually amazing. We had a poll in the field and did a report. 8 out of 10 doesn't go under 72% for Republicans, liberals, Democrats, hates corporate money in politics.
Rick Hertzberg.
You should know that more than any time in this election cycle, maybe more than any time ever, the possibility of a wrong winner election where one candidate gets more human votes and the other candidate gets more electoral votes is more alive than ever. You should know that both sides' oxes get gored. In 2000, it was the Democrats who got screwed. This time it could be the Republicans. You should know that the recount problem is not a problem, because that would happen only once in every 3,000 years. And you should know there's a solution. Go to nationalpopularvote.com and find out what it is.
I want to thank my guest today, Avik Roy, healthcare policy advisor to the Romney campaign, Elise Hogue from the Friends of Democracy Super PAC, Heather McGhee, the progressive think tank Demos, and Rick Hertzberg of the New Yorker Magazine. Thank you all, and thank you for joining us. We'll be back next weekend, Saturday and Sunday at 8 Eastern Time, our special pre-election coverage. If you're in the area, you can catch us live and in person. We'll be doing the show outside, right in front of 30 Rock. Should be a lot of fun. We'll hope you come out to see us. Come check us out. Coming up next, Melissa Harris Perry on today's MHP. The strategy the Obama campaign is using to seal the deal. It all comes down to one word, and that could mean what happens on November 6th. Doesn't matter at all, but will it work? That's Melissa Harris Perry. Coming up next, we'll see you next week here on Up.